I'm Associate Professor Leigh Boucher.
And I'm Professor Michelle Arrow.
And along with our colleagues, Associate Professor Barbara Baird from Flinders and Professor Robert Reynolds from here at Macquarie, we're the authors of I think we could call it groundbreaking, new book, Personal Politics, Sexuality, Gender and the Remaking of Australian Citizenship.
And it's coming out any day through Monash University Press. Personal Politics offers a history of gender, activism around gender and sexuality since the late 1960s, with a particular focus on the ways that this activism has transformed Australian citizenship.
And that was one of the really exciting things for us as a team, to bring a group of scholars with a really diverse expertise together to write the kind of history that we couldn't produce by ourselves. You know, this is a book that I think none of us could have written solo, and it's bringing our kind of diverse expertise and interests together over quite a long process of research and writing that's meant that we could have a much larger scope for this book than I think we could have done by ourselves.
Yeah. And the kind of pleasure of collaboration, I think, was really an important part of this book as well, that it wasn't just one of us working away, that we worked solo, but we also came collectively and discussed things. And I think the book is far better for the fact that it was a collaboratively produced volume than it was.
Yeah, the book takes a case study approach, so there's individual case studies of particular campaigns or particular activist moments or particular moments of contention in Australian politics. And we sort of conducted the research for those case studies solo, but we were meeting up with each other kind of every couple of months to have these incredible conversations. And in a sense, this book is really kind of those conversations about putting all these different case studies together and seeing what we can make of the story we were telling. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is making the personal political is a claim that activists in the 1970s make to describe what makes their politics different, right? They are making a forceful argument that issues or experiences that were previously considered the domain of private life should instead be properly politicised, right? So it is a slogan from the 70s. And this book starts with that slogan and then thinks about its historical consequences.
Yeah, the kind of that this is a moment in the 1970s which sort of framed as breaking apart this, public and private, and then kind of what are the consequences of that for Australian politics? Because if the personal is political, then whose personal becomes political, and what happens when everybody's personal is part of the political in that way. So
yeah, and we've seen this, I think we use the word proliferation in the book, a kind of proliferation of identities and campaigns in our political life, in our public culture, in what we might call the town square.
Yes.
Of different identities kind of emerging to make their claims. And there's kind of, in one sense, there's this puncturing of that divide or this reworking of that divide in the 1970s, and it opens the floodgates. And we are still, I think, as a national culture, but it's not just Australia, this is happening across the world, grappling with how to kind of adjudicate those claims, grappling with how to consider them, grappling with what happens when two different identities or two different sets of activists make claims that compete against each other. And how do we make a decision about which claims to reward with some kind of change? And this book is about the kind of really destabilising and uncertain consequences of that 1970s break.
So this is a book that is about the campaigns waged by a number of activists in a range of spheres. So campaigns for government funding of women's refuges, campaigns for the reform of family law and no-fault divorce, the long campaign for marriage equality. So it kind of takes a case study approach to look at a number of campaigns over a 50-year period.
Yeah, and in the book itself, what we do is look at two of these campaigns. We compare these campaigns side by side. So each chapter looks at two campaigns. Sometimes those pairings are really unusual or unexpected, and it's in kind of comparing, say, the campaign to try and protect the Safe Schools funding program, which was a program for education, essentially, in schools to provide safer spaces for trans and sexually diverse kids. And we compare that campaign to the campaign for funding waged by male activists in support of men's sheds. Now, most people would think that's a very odd pairing, trans kids, older white men in sheds, right? These are both campaigns about providing safe spaces. But what's interesting is in comparing them and the languages that they use, you can see the different outcomes they achieve. And that's part of what we're trying to think about in this book is what settlements are reached about these contests and campaigns.
I think this book is important because the kinds of politics that we are kind of investigating in the book are still very much at play in the present moment. If you look at the moment, for example, around the current discussion around domestic violence, the kind of national crisis around domestic violence, that is a political problem that is first identified, I suppose, in the 1970s. And activists from the women's movement took steps to kind of try and address that in the public sphere and make claims around recognition of the vulnerabilities of women fleeing violence, for the funding of women's refuges. And yet we're still having these struggles and debates 50 years on. So why is that? And I think our book is an attempt to kind of explain and address that particular problem.
Yeah, and I think these policy debates or political debates that happen now, they often, in our public life, they often have an implicit historical claim built into them. There's often claims about how this debate has unfolded or where we've come from. And we see this not just in relation to kind of domestic and intimate violence, but, campaigns for marriage equality, for example, or same-sex marriage, depended on this incredibly powerful story about the long arc of progress kind of building towards this moment when gays and lesbians would finally be admitted to full national citizenship. I think we call it the marriage bed of the nation. But, and that campaign depended on this story of 50 years of progress ending here. And that's a very powerful story. And I think lots of people felt that story in that moment, really felt it. And it felt very satisfying. But it's just really terrible history. And it doesn't help us to explain that 50 years, which is much more about gains and losses, but also about kind of new identities emerging, new ideas, reworking what that politics should look like. A gay activist in 1973 probably would not recognise a gay activist in 2020. And putting them together on a long arc of progress does not help us understand how we got to 2024 and what's happened before it.
With the work that Leigh did in the book on no-fault divorce, I think that really rewrites some of our assumptions about that reform, because I think what Leigh's identified is that some of the biggest advocates for no-fault divorce were men who wanted to get divorced and avoid the kind of obligations of alimony and those kinds of payments. So I think those kinds of rewritings of the history that we thought we knew, I think are really interesting.
Yeah, I came to that research on the Family Law Act, which was passed in 1975, this incredible reform, reflexively framed as a feminist success story. Just this amazing moment. And it does do incredible things in combination with the single mother's benefit or payment. It creates the possibility for many women to leave unhappy marriages that was not possible beforehand, or leave violent relationships. So it's a really important kind of, we might call feminist reform. In examining the debate about this reform more closely, I was incredibly surprised to find how many what we might call conservative, but I don't think that's a helpful term, but what we might call conservative kind of identities or ideas were part of that reform process. And so men arguing for more freedom, they wanted no-fault divorce. They wanted no-fault divorce so they could leave their marriages. Not something we normally think about. And actually after this reform is passed, there's this incredible kind of flowering of women who describe themselves as stay-at-home mothers who feel very betrayed by this reform. They feel like the agreement that they made with their husbands and with the state about what they would do and the duties they would perform and the rewards they would get had been ripped away from them, because what no-fault divorce means is that people are no longer kind of punitively constrained into staying into the marriage. And so it does free people from marriages, and not everyone is happy about that. And so that was a real surprise to me. I don't know, what was your favourite campaign, Michelle? I need some more time to think.
Working on Mardi Gras, like thinking about the kind of campaign that the Mardi Gras ran to kind of secure, sponsorship and things like that, making a kind of really bold claim to a kind of economic set of rights that were coming from what emerged or began as a kind of protest / celebration, became a very polished, accomplished kind of public event that was, worth an enormous amount of money to the New South Wales and the federal government. And doing that work as Mardi Gras itself was still engaging in these debates around, should we have corporate sponsorship? How is what is the role of sponsorship? What's this protest about? Is it a protest? Is it a celebration? That I found was really interesting, because it was something that occurred every year and the debates recurred every year.
And I think the history of Mardi Gras, which in one sense this book is in the background of this book, really.
Exactly.
Sketches out one of the big, reveals one of the big forces at play that we're interested in here, or that we became interested in because it revealed itself to us, which is that the rise of what we might call neoliberal kind of political philosophy or political ideology has really changed the way that activists will argue for change. Yeah. They make different kinds of promises. They present themselves in different ways. They present their constituencies in different ways. And certain forms of political claims have been much more successfully able to adapt themselves to that changing context. And I think, the success of Mardi Gras can be counterbalanced with the difficulty of domestic violence refuges, to make themselves legible in that context. Yeah. But in terms of favourite campaigns, look, this is perhaps a strange one to kind of use as an example, but working on the kind of conservative women responding to the Family Law Act in 1975, who see that as a betrayal, or articulate a sense of betrayal, both by the state and government and by the wider world for sort of casting them aside, who see this idea of freedom not as a virtue, but instead as a loss of their legitimacy and a loss of the protection. It really challenged, it was my favourite campaign to work on because it really challenged some of the assumptions that I might bring to something like family law, and to think really carefully about the pace of change that this book traces, that, the changes we've witnessed in ideas about gender and sexuality in a 50-year period are remarkable and quick, so fast. And, the difference between a family law setting before and after 1975, that gulf is large. And I think in some ways we can see in sometimes the responses a kind of whiplash about that change, and a kind of grappling with that change, which I found really interesting to sort of think with. I would like somebody to read our book and walk away thinking about two things. Thinking about how the kind of categories, stories, terms and ideas that we use to describe ourselves and thus to make our politics change over time. So they feel incredibly personal to us, and they feel like they're coming from the inside out, and my identity as a gay man feels like it's coming from inside myself and is kind of set in stone. But our book shows that the ideas through which people have understood themselves and made their politics are incredibly historically variable and change over time. And I hope that somebody reading this book will walk away and maybe feel a little less certain about the story they tell about themselves, and a little more partial and a little more open to the idea that it could change over time, because that's what history tells us. I think a kind of rigidity has crept into our politics around some of these issues, and I hope that a book like ours can kind of just loosen up some of those rigidities just a little bit. I would love for that to be an outcome for the book, and I'd love our public debate to have a little more historical literacy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, one of the things that Leigh talked about earlier was the sort of idea that we often tell these stories around activism, around women's rights, LGBTIQ rights, as a kind of simple story of progress. And we kind of know that that's really, I think, it's helpful, it's appealing, but it's an appealing narrative, but it's not a very helpful one, because it really kind of mutes or forgets so much of what made this history complicated. And when you read these things, you realise how hard it is to make change, how hard it is to win reform, how hard it is to get the funding that you need to do the things you want. And, you know, I think that our current political debate is full of a lot of talk, but perhaps, you know, not necessarily the same amount of support for action. And it'd be really great, I think, if people, you know, if it reminds people that making change is really hard, and to put your energy where it's going to do the most good, I think is really helpful too.